We hope you enjoy a happier, saner life. A Marijuana Anonymous member panel meeting featuring Dr. Sepella recorded during the 2022 MA Convention. In alignment with the 12 traditions of Marijuana Anonymous, and so that we may never divert from our primary purpose, Marijuana Anonymous states the following disclaimer. Marijuana Anonymous does not endorse Dr. Sepella or his expressed opinions. The statements made and the opinions expressed by Dr. Sepella and the MA members in this recording are solely their own. Dr. Sepella has provided consent to Marijuana Anonymous to record this session, share his name, and this recording with the public. Dr. Sepella was not provided with any financial compensation for speaking at the 2022 MA Convention.
Hi, my name is Amy, and I'm a marijuana addict.
Hi.
Thank you for attending this Hospitals and Institutions panel of Marijuana Anonymous. In a moment, we will have some readings followed by two MA members who will share their thoughts on what has led them to possibly be in hospitals, or institutions, or be in incarceration. And then we'll have Dr. Sepella, who will share his experience in writing a doctor's opinion. And Marijuana Anonymous this is the preamble. Marijuana Anonymous is a fellowship of people who share our experience, strength, and hope with each other, that we may solve our common problem and help others to recover from marijuana addiction. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop using marijuana. There are no dues or fees for membership. We are self-supporting through our own contributions. MA is not affiliated with any religious or secular institution or organization and has no opinion on any outside controversies or causes. Our primary purpose is to stay free of marijuana and to help the marijuana addict who still suffers achieve the same freedom. We can do this by practicing our suggested 12 steps of recovery and by being guided as a group by our 12 traditions. And I'm just going to come down into the audience and ask for someone to do a reading. Thank you. Would you like to read who is a marijuana addict, how it works, the 12 questions? Okay.
Thank you. I'm Andrea, alcoholic addict.
Hi, Andrea.
And I invite you to mouth along with me so that you can start getting your muscle memory for memorizing the steps. How it works. The practice of rigorous honesty. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No? Who said no? All right, being sassy. All right. The practice of rigorous honesty, of opening our hearts and minds, and the willingness to go to any length to have a spiritual awakening are essential to our recovery. Our old ideas and way of life no longer work for us. Our suffering shows us that we need to let go absolutely. We surrender ourselves to a power greater than ourselves. Here are the steps we take which are suggested for recovery. 1, we admitted we are powerless over marijuana, that our lives had become unmanageable. 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood God. 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. 5, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. 6, we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. 7, humbly asked God to remove our shortcomings. 8, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. 9, made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. 10, continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood God, praying only for the knowledge of God's will for us and the power to carry that out. 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to marijuana addicts and to practice these principles in all our affairs. Do not be discouraged. None of us are saints. Our program is not easy, but it is simple. We strive for progress, not perfection. Our experiences before and after we entered recovery teach us 3 important ideas: that we are marijuana addicts and cannot manage our own lives, that probably no human power can relieve our addiction, and that our higher power can and will if sought.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria.
Now, our speakers will introduce themselves. Please tell us your name and how long you've been clean and sober in MA, and then your experience with marijuana addiction.
Hi, I'm Wendy E., and I am a marijuana addict. I've been clean and sober and off Facebook for 2 years, 3 months, and 1 day.
My name is Christopher, and I'm a marijuana addict. Thank you. And I have, coming up in January, I'll have 13 years. So 12, thank you. So just about 12 and a half years.
Our panelists will now share their stories. So we'll have Wendy and Christopher share, and then we'll move on to Dr. Sepella. And so please go ahead, Wendy and Christopher.
Hi, everybody. Still Christopher, still a marijuana addict. And I'd like to share you today one of the reasons, or it's probably several reasons, why Wendy and we decided to start this. And it was really only, I think, maybe a month or two back that I realized that we're running a dual diagnosis meeting. I don't see myself as somebody with mental illness. I have been told by therapists that I was not crazy, but marijuana caused psychosis for me. I had what some people know as termed marijuana-induced psychosis. And it brought me to the depths of despair, as we've heard in our literature. It brought me to a place where I considered suicide. I was, at one point as a teenager, about 13 years old, I felt suicidal, but that was because of coming to terms with my sexuality, which I really didn't even start to understand until my late 20s, mid 30s, that I always thought, I've got to be straight or gay, nothing else. Well, turns out I'm neither. I'm bisexual. But and then so marijuana, I think I was using that to cover up a lot of my confusion and trying to meet the I guess the moral codes that my parents were trying to set forth for me. So it was just a big struggle, year after year. And marijuana just helped me ignore all the, the pain and the confusion. And there were times where I remember in college where I wish that I had checked myself into a mental health hospital, a facility, because I probably would have gotten some professional help earlier on. And then other times in college, I remember trying to impress friends through marijuana use, and I ended up getting into stealing. I remember one night we came back from a rainbow festival. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of those, where I was high probably the whole weekend. Took all my clothes off except for my shoes and was walking around naked for an entire day at this festival. Anyway, we get back to my college town, and one night I'm sneaking onto a delivery truck at a bakery. Little did I know that right across the street, we saw the fire department there. Little did I know that there was a fire person looking out the window, watching me break into a truck. And I ended up spending the night in jail. It was probably a good thing for me. But I don't want to go back to jail. And I don't want to go to a mental hospital, a mental health facility. I want to stay out of those places. And that's why I continue to work on my sobriety, because I know it could take me back to those places, or it could I could end up dead. So, I heard early on, even before I found MA in another program, I heard that, there's usually 3 ends to somebody who doesn't find recovery. It's a mental hospital, jail, or, an institution, jail, or death. And I could have, easily found any one of those 3 ends to my path. So I'm really grateful, for MA, that it keeps me out of all of those places, especially out of death. And I can celebrate my life, with all of you. And I can be up here, shining a light on the suffering, that I went through, and what I was trying to hide from myself. Lack of self-esteem, I've got that now. I've got self-esteem. Lack of, thank you. Fear of trusting other people, inability to trust. I've got that now. I'm pretty good at trusting others, or I'm getting better. So, but yeah, I'm thrilled to be here and sharing the virtual stage, as it were, with Dr. Marv Sepella. And I'm thrilled to hear what he has to say about what marijuana can and still is doing, especially with the increased potency of marijuana that we see today, what it's doing to the minds and the behavior of people who are compulsively using. So with that, that's my time. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Christopher. And thank you, everybody, for putting this together and participating today. My name is Wendy, and I too am still a marijuana addict. Hi. I came to this program through the mental ward door. I was introduced to Marijuana Anonymous through a therapist at an IOP, or intensive outpatient program, after I had spent time hospitalized during the first lockdown of COVID. What happened was someone in my family came down with COVID, and it broke something inside of me because I assumed they were going to die and their entire part of the family was going to die. And I just couldn't get my mind around that. So, that's when pot turned on me. I started using when I was a teenager back in the 70s in high school, as many people start in high school. And I held on to that persona. The first time I got high, I was like, this is me. I am the hippie stoner. I will be that to the day I die. I will be the gray-haired woman in the rocking chair kissing her bong. And I was, because I wasn't a quitter. For over 45 years, I used pot. And the first time I bought it legally was amazing. I mean, I had dreamed my whole life that it would become mainstream and legal, and here it was. But I always considered myself an outsider. So when I first got sober, I thought, I was kind of trying to figure out who I was then. I'm still a hippie, but I'm also still an outsider, because now that pot is mainstream, we are still the outsiders. We've been there, we've done that. So finding this program has been profound to me. I was highly functional, so I won't say that I, didn't learn anything from my life, but seeing things through a new lens now that's clear of all of that smoke screen, I'm kind of redefining a lot of my memories and seeing where, I was showing signs of addiction at that point, and being able to know myself a little bit better. Finding the program, finding a wonderful sponsor, working the steps as diligently as I could. I was holding on for dear life, because literally I was suicidal before I came to this program. So I dug as deep as I could into each one of the steps. And I used a thesaurus to do the definitions, because a dictionary wasn't enough for me. I had to find the definition that resonated with me, that I could then accept that step. So that's how I work with my sponsees now. And we really try to dig in and find whatever definition works at that moment. So doing that has changed my life. I'm now finding moments of grace, I call them, where all of a sudden I can be sitting there and I'm like, what's going on? I feel happy. And I don't feel like I have to augment it. This is enough. This is fulfilling my heart. And knowing that I can, see how I'm doing on time, that I can share that with others is a big part of me. So this is a big part of my recovery. Being able to give back is huge for me because there's nothing I could ever return what I have gotten from this program and from all of you, and being able to be in this room and on the Zoom and speak in front of all of these people. I did it.
Thanks, Wendy.
We're now going to go over to Dr. Marv Sepella to do his share, and let's welcome him. Thanks.
Hi, it's just a pleasure to be here with everybody tonight. I'm sorry I can't be in San Diego. I'd hoped to, but I'd already had to go to a conference. I'm in a hotel room in Indianapolis. I'm giving a talk here tomorrow. I'm Marv, and I'm an addict and alcoholic. And I just celebrated last month 47 years. And and I want to thank Amy for working all this out, and I want to thank Christopher and Wendy for doing their shares because they were wonderful and pertinent. And you know, I wrote a doctor's opinion about marijuana addiction for the new edition of Life and Hope at the request of some people in MA, and they had no clue who I really was or what my background was. But it was just a treat to write that. And I had actually written a piece kind of like that for some friends who wrote another book that they tried to kind of do an updated version of AA's big book. And I wrote it, and then they took it and they kind of altered it. So they said it had to speak to people at a 7th grade education. And by the time they changed it, it hardly said anything. So it was wonderful to write something that I could just talk about what it's really like and the problems as they exist. But at the time they told me they didn't want me to mention that I was in recovery. So it doesn't mention that, which was a little unfortunate, but that's a fine, that's how they wanted it for the book. I kind of wanted to call it another doctor's opinion, just to distinguish it from the first one, but to reveal that it is, it's a historical piece as well. So I dropped out of high school. I was disowned by my family. So my addiction started really young at about 12. And I ended up in treatment at 17 and finally got, and this is in 1974. And then I didn't stay sober, didn't stay abstinent. The first thing I went back to was marijuana. And later, in 1975, at 19, I got sober in AA in Rochester, Minnesota, near where I grew up. And I, in spite of dropping out of high school, I ended up getting a job at the Mayo Clinic in a research lab, and was influenced by all these doctors from around the world who came to do fellowships there while I was in my early recovery. And I decided I really liked what they did and wanted to be a doctor too. I told my sponsor this, and he said, you know, Marv, if it's God's will, it'll happen. And apparently it was. I mean, it somehow happened. And I still can't believe it. On my 1-year anniversary, I started my first college class, and I went to medical school planning to be a cardiac surgeon because the guy who influenced me the most was a cardiac surgeon. And when I saw how many people were in the hospital for addiction-related problems, anywhere from getting a foot cut off because of nicotine dependence, or psychosis from marijuana, hallucinogens, whatever, I started complaining about it at the AA meeting I attended. MA didn't exist then, and there was no NA where I got sober, and I used anything and everything. I really didn't discern. So I say I'm an addict and alcoholic, but when I saw all these people with problems and we weren't evaluating them, we weren't diagnosing them, we weren't referring them to treatment, and I started complaining about this at my home group every week. And after a few weeks of this, two of the doctors that were at the meeting, the only two doctors at the meeting, took me aside and said, Marv, you've got to quit bitching about this and do something about it. And that's what I did. I decided to go into psychiatry, and I did an addiction fellowship. So I specialized in addiction, and I've devoted my career to that. I was for about 20 years the chief medical officer of Hazel and Betty Ford Foundation. And I left that position in December last year to take kind of a sabbatical and take care of myself and ski a lot with my son and enjoy my new granddaughter and my wife and daughter. And so I've had some time off, and now I'm going to do a little part-time work. But in the meantime, I thought I'd give you both my recovery background a little bit, as well as my professional background, to see why writing that piece was so important to me. And it's so important to me to be here to speak with you tonight. And there's been slow advances in brain research in regard to marijuana and addiction itself, and understanding the neurophysiology behind it. Not much has changed in regard to what I wrote. In that regard, no big significant theoretical changes or research that's described something different than is in that piece. However, as mentioned a little bit ago, the increased potency of marijuana is really problematic, and in regard to the side effects. So that more common for people to get psychotic. Intractable vomiting has become a common sort of thing in emergency rooms. There's people that have had such increases in heart rate and blood pressure from smoking these really high potency marijuanas that they end up in emergency rooms with heart attacks. So it's just a lot of strange things going on that had never been seen before. And also, when you look at the history of addiction around the world, and what you find is when a new substance is introduced to a culture who hasn't used it, or a new way of using that substance, like the best example is crack cocaine, suddenly smoking it, or there's a remarkable change in potency of a substance, which we're experiencing with marijuana. The addiction rates really do go up pretty significantly. And it's especially problematic for our youth, because historically there's been national surveys of youth and adults, actually, but mostly this is in regard to youth, looking at their perception of risk associated with all kinds of drugs. But when they looked at marijuana, they could map it over like a decade or so. And when perception of risk increased, use of it by adolescents decreased. And when perception of risk decreases, use increases. So as you can imagine, with legalization all over the country, perception of risk has decreased dramatically among our youth, and use is going up. And it was to predictable. And I actually come down on the side of legalization because I had a friend who got caught, dealing some bags of marijuana to friends like me, and was put in prison and has had a pretty rough life as a result of that. So it's neat to see the Biden administration now taking some of these issues on. However, I voted against it. I live in Oregon. I voted against legalization there because they didn't protect our youth. They did nothing to try to help understand that there is risks associated with marijuana use. One of the main one is that some of us get addicted to it. Only about 9%, but probably higher with these new forms with the high potency. So it's not a lot. It's not the vast majority don't become addicted to it. We're just the lucky ones that do, and then find recovery. And I wanted to just also mention one other thing, and that is that if your parents are planning to be parents, the number one risk factor for addiction of any kind is genetic. And so, as a parent, I told my kids about my recovery, and I told them about the risks that they faced, because for parents, if someone has a parent that has this disease, it doesn't matter what drug or alcohol or whatever they were addicted to, or what multiple substances, at least a 6 times as likely possibility that they're going to become addicted. And so they need us to help them through that. They need us to love them, to care for them. They need us to be good, stewards of recovery, and to live the best lives we can, because that's about the only thing we know now that can reduce the risk that they face because of genetics. Mm-hmm. So that's the last thing I wanted to say in regard to comments, and I'm glad to take questions.
So we'd like to take some questions from the audience. And, oh yeah, Christopher and Wendy are going to start out, and then we'll take a few questions from the audience. And then we're going to pop over to Zoom for some questions over there too. So I'll step down and talk to you if you have a question. Okay, so let's go with Christopher and Wendy first.
Thank you. Dr. Sepella, so as you were speaking, it got me to thinking about, oh yeah, thank you. Got me thinking about AA and their, I'm just wondering if you happen to know, you might not, but if AA dealt with something similar, like, was moonshine invented, a few years after AA formed, did the potency of alcohol get stronger over time, or was 200 proof always a thing? I don't really know.
I think 200 proof preceded AA, because moonshine's been around for a long time, and so for alcohol itself, they've never gone through anything like this, and so Marijuana Anonymous is really facing this in a way that I don't think other groups have before. I don't know about the Cocaine Anonymous folks when crack cocaine came along and smoking cocaine became so popular. But this is a big change, and in some respects, like Christopher and Wendy described, it may help, produce enough discord that people will find their way here quicker. But it's also going to happen for people that aren't addicted, and that's actually more common, even because they're just naive to this stuff, and then they take this really potent drug, and suddenly they're in trouble. It's more likely to happen in people that have a family history of psychosis too. But in a general way, I suspect we're going to see more people entering Marijuana Anonymous worldwide because of this potency issue.
Right. Well, thank you very much for that kind of validation that we already know, but it's important, I think, for us to be aware of what's coming down the track for us as MA members, the newcomers that we're going to be dealing with in the coming years. Thank you.
There's a question in the chat that asks, are there any studies of long-term medical effects of prolonged marijuana use, even in people who are no longer using? And there's a lot of studies that are ongoing, and the difficulty with studying long-term marijuana use in a research setting for medical, issues is that such a high percentage also smoked tobacco. And so when they try and do the studies and ferret out the tobacco users, they end up with so few people. And so it's been hard to get this kind of data up to this point in time. They're getting larger and larger groups that they are studying, and those studying long-term effects takes a long time, right? It can take years and decades even to really understand some of these things. So there's evidence of, and concern about the possibility of lung cancer, and yet it hasn't been proven, partially because of that tobacco effect, and partially because if it is happening, it's not that common, I suspect. So it's been really hard to figure out. So there's still suspicion that is a possibility, but no absolute proof. And then some of the brain changes, the cognitive changes, like memory in particular. Marijuana really nailed my memory badly, but for short-term periods, and ultimately it came back. And I remember when I first got sober, and mine is clouded by other substance use as well, but memory and marijuana go together. Methamphetamine causes extreme memory problems as well, but way worse than marijuana, actually. But only for people who really use that a great deal. But for me, I was sober 6 months and working in the same place where I would go down the elevator and go to the cafeteria and go to these machines and get something to eat out of them pretty much daily, if not a couple times a day. And 6 months in, I went down there and realized I didn't have to think about how I got there for the first time. I mean, and then when I started college, which was 6 months after that episode, I had great difficulty initially. I had trouble with all my first tests. I just couldn't remember things, and part of it was not knowing how to study. But by the end of the semester, so coming up on a year and a half, I was really doing well, and my memory really came around. And that's the primary experience that's described in the research, that we have short-term memory problems as a result of marijuana use, and not a lot of lasting problems, although there is that potential, and they're studying that in an ongoing way too. I hope that's helpful.
We're going to jump to a question here in the room now.
I'm curious how you would answer the question, either as a doctor or a person in recovery, or the claim that marijuana is simply not addictive.
Oh man, yeah. It's just plain false. It is addictive, and almost all the substances that we get addicted to have had proponents that they're not addicting, right? I think it's both, comes with the territory that in the midst of this addiction, we don't recognize it. And once we really have addiction, we certainly are going to argue that we don't have it. But also societally, people don't understand this disease, and they just think we should be able to stop. So a lot of people don't even understand that this is a disease and that addiction happens. They just think that we don't know how to handle it. And that's still pretty prevalent perspective. But the research is pretty solid, there are people who do get addicted to marijuana. Absolutely, no question about that. As we define addiction right now, and then those definitions have changed over time, but in spite of the changing definitions, it was more an attempt to refine how they defined addiction, and there was no real change in the fact that it exists, even for marijuana. Marijuana is a pretty powerful medicine, basically. When you think about, we have an internal cannabis system. They call it an internal cannabinoid system. It's responsible for all kinds of neurologic activity, mostly in our brain, but also throughout our body, and in controlling nerve function, really fine tuning nerve function in a lot of ways. And so when we do use THC, it's overdriving that system that already exists. It doesn't just randomly make us high. And as a result, it's playing a role directly on brain receptors and brain function. And the whole description of addiction of any kind to any substance, and even the non-substance addictions, the functional addictions, the parts of the brain involved remain the same for marijuana as for the other substances.
So this is Christopher. Just in response to that question as well, I'd like to say that each of us has
now that the marijuana
choice
is intensity
whether or
is
not
increased.
To break our own anonymity. I have the luxury of being able to do that with my loved ones, with my coworkers, and tell them, I can't use marijuana. I can't be around it. I can't be around people who use marijuana or be in places where marijuana is being used. For the most part. I don't want to bother with getting triggered because I know firsthand it's addictive for me, and I've taught a lot of people a lot about marijuana addiction just through personal sharing. Thanks.
Okay, we have another question from the audience.
When I first started sponsoring an MA, we were just walking people through the steps, and we weren't dealing with people who were on, psychosis medication, or dealing with therapists, or, we're not trained therapists, we're sponsorship. We're sponsors, and other members in recovery. So I'm wondering if you could address some tips and tricks, or how we might work with people who are coming in with more things that a sponsor should be doing. And that's sort of the line.
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad to. Since most of my career has been on that side of things, when people have psychiatric aspects of substance use disorders or addiction, I've worked with a lot of sponsors over the years in that capacity, and it's helped me kind of understand how to differentiate those sorts of things. And if people have psychosis, it's important that they see trained professionals that deal with psychosis. And I think sponsorship is about recovery, but also about supporting them and doing what's right for themselves physically, mentally, and spiritually. And so on the mental side of things, if they are having difficulties with psychosis, and especially if it's lasting into recovery, getting professional help is really necessary. It's too difficult for and it's an odd thing. I remember in my psychiatric training, I'd had my own experiences with hallucinogens and with marijuana. I was hearing things regularly for a while late at night, that sort of thing, hallucinations. So I had my experience with psychosis, but I knew it was the drugs because it didn't happen at any other time. I just assumed it was anyway. I didn't know which one. But the first time I was in a psychiatric setting in my training and saw someone responding to the heat ducts in the room, and talking to it as if he was having a conversation, I was really surprised by that. And it's psychosis basically is a fixed false belief, and if it's fixed and false, it's hard to manage, for that individual and for anyone that's trying to help them out. And we're trained to do that. We can use psychotherapies and medications to help people with that sort of thing, and they'll be a lot better off in the long run. So I'd say the sponsorship about helping them, find a route to address those issues and not try to do it oneself. I think it's fine to discuss one's own history of such experiences, because I think that's really helpful for them to hear that it isn't unusual and that you can get help for it.
Maybe I have a brief response to
Okay.
that.
Just to say that I think it's important for us to stay knowledgeable about what's going on in the world outside of MA. I listen to podcasts, I read lots of articles about forms of cannabinoids or cannabis extracts and the potency and the effect. So I do a lot of reading and research, just so that my potential next sponsee, I'll know. Like a few years ago, somebody said dabs, shatter, wax. I had no idea what those things were, but I eventually took the time to learn. So I don't seem like an old fogey.
It's true for me as well. I have to keep up, and I try and keep up both professionally and talking with, young people who are in the midst of it.
My name's Michael, a marijuana addict. Thank you, Dr. Sepella. May I accord you the medical saint of MA? like Dr. Silkworth is to AA. In the doctor's opinion, in the big book, Dr. Silkworth talks about the two components, the mental obsession and the physical allergy, the abnormal reaction after the substance is ingested. I'm down with the mental obsession, and once I smoke, I want to smoke more and more and more. Is there a marijuana equivalent to this phenomenon of craving, this physical aspect to the addiction?
There is. It's not, in regard to physical, it's, when we think in terms of withdrawal, alcohol withdrawal, of course, much more obvious and much more dangerous. Opioid withdrawal, much more obvious than marijuana withdrawal. But marijuana withdrawal can be measured physiologically and has been described pretty readily, especially with these higher potency THC substances available. And yet, when I read the doctor's opinion in the AA text, I absolutely as well agree with the mental obsession, and I can't come to grips with the term allergy, because it just doesn't describe it well. I think it's an old understanding of that term, and I've heard other physicians speak to that and really come to a point of saying, okay, allergy works if you use this really broad, vague definition. And that's about the only way it does work. And that would be a nice thing to update, because right now, in describing the course of addiction, because most people don't become addicted. Most people use these substances without getting caught up in it like we do. So, and like I said, the genetic risk factor is the biggest risk factor. There's environmental risk factors like abuse, stress, those sorts of things that also play a role. A psychiatric illness itself puts us at higher risk for addiction. But when you look at the neurophysiology behind it, there's been an increasingly accepted theory that suggests that the kind of the benefits or the high associated with any of these substances, the intoxication itself, that's basically positive reinforcement. It feels good, so I'm going to do it again. and people that use socially, and people like us, that early in our careers of our use, man, I loved it. I mean, I wanted more. I wanted to do it again. I wanted to try this drug and that drug. I just couldn't get enough. And then it turned on me, and it became increasingly painful, both psychically and physically. And by physically, I mean more of a psychic kind of thing. But it's like now the description is that casual use, recreational use, and early use in addiction is all about positive reinforcement. It still works. It still feels good, and we pursue it because it does. Just like we do great food, good chocolate, whatever. And yet we cross this barrier, this line or whatever, and it becomes a matter of negative reinforcement. And negative reinforcement's definition is the relief of pain. We do it again because it relieves pain. And for me, that pain was, just the shame and guilt of my behavior. I couldn't stand myself anymore, couldn't stand what I was doing to those around me. And yet I couldn't do anything about it. I didn't know what was wrong or what I could do. And then there's the withdrawal aspect of it when we stop using, or even when we are between bouts of using, or for certain things, even just overnight, we start to go into minor withdrawal. And there's this angst that occurs. It's kind of like a mild depression and anxiety combination. Just fills us, and we want to go back for more and get that relief. And that's how they're starting to define addiction itself, and crossing that line from say social or at least not unhealthy use to addiction is when it goes from something that continues to reinforce in a positive way to something that's about relief of the pain. And I think that's a real useful way of looking at all this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So a question in the chat from Harold L. and something sort of related from Kalita, but Harold L. asks, how do you work with newcomers that are on medication? And we do say in our literature about using prescribed medications, is that as non-professionals in the mental health industry, we're non-professionals in that sense, but we cannot hold a potential sponsee accountable. If they are misusing their medication, that's between them and their doctor. That we have to, if they're overdosing, then certainly we have a ethical duty to kind of maybe report that, so that they're not ending up dead on our doorstep. But yeah, with newcomers that are on medication, I am on medication, low dose, but I think that we cannot speak to, and related to Kalita's question about particular medications, we're just not knowledgeable enough as MA members. But I see that Kalita is asking about gabapentin, the only medication that helps with marijuana withdrawals. Have you heard of that, Marv?
I have heard of gabapentin, and it helps. It can be helpful for some people with any kind of withdrawal, actually, from all of the substances, and thus also for marijuana, it can be beneficial. It's usually not something that, if that's the issue and it's being used for that purpose, it's usually not something that needs to be lasting, for months even. So I'd say that, and if it's used for anxiety disorders that are separate, though, that could be a useful long-term medication for people, relatively safe in recovery. it has been misused in really high dosages, mostly by healthcare professionals because they have access to lots of it and can take lots of it. So there is a downside to it as well. And I agree with what Christopher just described, that when I attend, meetings, I do not try to help people with their medications. And I don't speak to that stuff. I'm there as an AA member, MA member, whatever. And so when people ask me about that stuff, I'll provide information, but I won't provide them with any kind of decision making. And I'll suggest that they go and speak to their healthcare professional, their psychiatrist, their psychologist, whatever. Especially if it's medications, that talk with their prescriber about those issues. And if they're seeing prescribers that don't know addiction, which is really commonplace, because the truth is, right now in medical school, even though this addiction as a whole, if you look at all the substance use disorders, affects as many people as any disease, basically. It's very, very common. It's one of the most common reasons, one of the most common illnesses seen in primary care. And yet in medical school, 4 years of medical school, on average, there's still about 24 to 48 hours devoted to this disease. And in general, less than 1 week in almost all medical schools. It's starting to change a little bit with the opioid crisis, but if people get that in their training, and once they become specialists, then they get nothing about it unless they're in psychiatry, maybe in a family practice program or at a place where someone on the faculty is in recovery or real interested and does some teaching, so that they really finish their training with hardly any information about addiction and recovery and what that means. And so you do want to see somebody that actually has that background in one way or another. If they've trained in addiction with a fellowship, if they've done other training related to addiction, or if they're in recovery and have a special interest in it as a physician or nurse practitioner or whatever, and it's hard to find those people, but it's necessary as a sponsor, as friends of people in recovery, to help them find the right folks, because it's real easy for them to get into trouble with the wrong folks. They'll get put on benzodiazepines, like Xanax and Ativan or Valium or Librium or something commonly. A lot of docs don't understand that just isn't a good idea and can be really harmful and problematic. Now, someone like me, with this being kind of my expertise, this combination dual diagnosis, basically, on a rare occasion, and I haven't done it for years, I'll put someone on a benzodiazepine that nothing else works for because they have such severe panic attacks or something that they absolutely have to have it. And that requires going through a whole evaluation process and making sure that they've had multiple trials of other means of addressing that situation before we take the risk of putting them on something like that. And, my colleagues that don't have that background, they don't even think about such things. They just kind of go for the quick answer, basically, and what they would give to anybody else without even thinking about the addiction because they don't know it. Now, when I say that about physicians, psychologists, there's no specialty in addiction in psychology. So that's also a problematic area. There's certainly people that have taken an interest in it and learned a great deal about recovery that are psychologists. Nursing, the same thing. There's no good training for nursing. Social workers, the same thing. So our whole medical workforce is ill prepared to deal with our disease, basically. Getting better. There's been an attempt to develop addiction fellowships around the country, and they've been able to add fellowships. That means they're training more people specifically in addiction. nurses are getting more training and even having like a specialty track they can do now. And a lot of mental health programs for psychologists and social workers are adding courses and training in addiction. But in a general way, it's still pretty abysmal.
All right. Well, we have come to a close for our time for now. If any of the, I see a lot of great questions went into the chat. If any questions went unanswered, feel free to send them on to hospitals and institutions at marijuana-anonymous.org, or HI for short at marijuana-anonymous.org. And Amy, could you maybe could wrap us up here?
Yes.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So I've asked Davey O to read our awakening.
Nice. Doesn't, okay. All right, I don't have to do this from memory. Hi, my name is Davey O, and I'm a marijuana addict. Those of us who have rigorously and thoroughly taken all the steps can attest to the fact that we have become stronger people. As we make spiritual progress, we begin to feel emotionally secure. Our new attitudes bring about self-esteem, inner strength, and serenity that is not easily shaken by any of life's hard times. Our awakening has come about as a result of a spiritual house cleaning, being aware of who we are and cultivating a growing relationship with our higher power. That relationship can lessen the role of fear as the main source of motivation in our lives. We know that our needs will be met, perhaps not in the ways that we had hoped for, but in ways from which we can truly grow. We have found that freedom from fear is much more important than freedom from want. We start to accept the unpleasantness in our lives and become grateful when we are able to experience growth from it. We learn to give without expecting rewards. We act as responsible members of society, living not in isolation, but with a sense of community. We become true partners with our friends and loved ones. With the help of a higher power, we respond positively to adversity. Practicing the principles we learn by taking the 12 steps produces rewards beyond calculation. With a deep sense of gratitude and the help of a power greater than ourselves, we can live in spiritual, emotional, and physical recovery. We live with serenity and security, one day at a time, humbly seeking to do the will of a higher power. We find we can now live useful lives. As a result, we reap benefits which we had thought unattainable, even unimaginable. As we each work the program in our own special way, we discover the spiritual principles that we all have in common. We are all unique examples of how the program works, each of us with our own distinct gifts to share. We take these steps for ourselves, not by ourselves. Others have gone before, others will follow. We recover.
Thank you, everybody, for being here today. And a big thanks to Dr. Sepella. Thank you so much. Take care. Have a good evening.